Today, I'm going to show you how to keep text and other details sharp in your materials, even with low-res textures. Let's go. Alright, I gotta admit to you guys, I'm pretty excited to show you this today. This is a really cool technique. Let me just kind of show you the results here first, and then we'll jump in and I'll show you step by step how to set it up. So what I've got here is the text on the top row is using just a traditional method. I put this word fishing shop here into my texture. So I have a 2K texture and I added this word into that texture and just saved it. Then on the second row, I added this word in using the shader with a special technique that I'm going to show you in a minute. So let me show you the results. When I zoom in here, first of all, you can see that these letters are kind of chunky looking and they're dependent on the pixels in the texture, but these letters are significantly more smoothed and rounded. Now, right now we have a 2K texture, so that chunkiness doesn't really matter that much. But let me go ahead and reduce this texture from 2K down to 512, and now you can see that top row is just completely destroyed. There's not enough resolution to maintain nice smooth letters, but the second row is maintaining its quality. Now, to be fair, I haven't reduced the resolution on the text in this second row. This is a separate image that's actually 1280 by 128. But let me go ahead and reduce this image as well. So I'm going to take this word, and currently it's at 1280, and I'm going to reduce this image from 1280 down to 512 itself. Did you see that? So now I'm looking at a significantly reduced texture, but it's still smooth, has nicely blended edges, and it's holding up its detail, unlike the one above it, which is just like completely falling apart. So I bet you're wondering, how are you doing that? And that's what I'm going to show you right now. So let's jump in and I'll show you the details. And then once we're done in Unreal, I'll also show you how to do this in Unity. So let's first start out in Photoshop. And here is the texture that I'm using as my source. This is a 2K texture. And you can just see that I've added the word fishing shop here just using Photoshop's text tools. And so what I'm going to do is take this text, and it's on a separate layer, and instead of adding it into my texture here, let's just leave it out of this texture. And I'll make a separate image that has the text on it. So I just took that text as it is and found the closest power of 2 size, which is 1280 by 128. So this is a fairly small image here. There it is, actual size, just 1280 by 128. Okay, and if I zoom in here, you can see that the text is a little bit chunky. There's some anti-aliasing on it, but it's still kind of chunky. So let me show you the secret sauce. I have an effects layer here, and it's set to stroke. So let's turn this effects layer on. And now you can see that I've blurred out the edges. And you might be asking, well, I thought the goal was to make it sharp, so why are you blurring it? And this this quote from Cars comes to mind, where Lightning McQueen says that I need to turn right to go left. And that's kind of what we're doing here. I'm using this stroke effects. Let me just open the effects panel, and I apologize, I know this is really small. Maybe I'll post a link to a screen grab of this so you can see it a little bit easier. So if we go to the stroke settings, we're going to set the position to outside, the fill type to gradient, the type to shape burst, and then we're setting the size to 7 pixels. Now this 7 pixels here is a little bit subjective. You can set this to whatever you want. What you want to make sure is that your gradient doesn't go off the edge. So if I set this too high and it's getting clipped out the edge, that's what I want to be careful for. So I'm just setting this to 7 pixels, and it gives a nice smooth gradient from the edge leading outward. And then in the shader, I can do a little bit of math to find a sharp edge somewhere between black and white. I can tune this value so that the shader is finding the sharp edge in this texture instead of trying to make a sharp edge with the pixels that are inherently not sharp. They're pixelated and square. So I'm going to use this stroke filter to apply that nice gradient. And then I can just flatten the image and save it out as a grayscale PNG file. So I'm saving it as grayscale so that it can be really small. And then I can bring it into Unreal and Unity. And then in the shader, I can do some math to, like I said, to find the edge to sharpen up this text. All right, so let's jump back into Unreal. We'll go ahead and import our textures, and I'll show you how to create the shader. So I'm going to open the content drawer here, and we'll switch to our textures. So here is my fishing shop texture. We can zoom in here. You can see I've set the maximum texture size to 512. If I just set this to 0, it'll jump back up to the 2K version of it. Again, you can see when I zoom in here, the letters are starting to get just a little bit jaggedy around the edges. Since this is an albedo texture or diffuse texture, I've got it set to sRGB on, and I have my compression setting to just default. All right, and then the other texture that I need to bring in is the word fishing shop. And like I said, in Photoshop, we sized this to 1280 by 128 because it was the closest power of 2 that fit around my text. And again, if we zoom in on this one, you can see that the edges are really fuzzy. So here I've set my compression settings to grayscale, and I've set my sRGB to off. So this is just a linear texture, not an sRGB texture. All right, and if I set my maximum texture size to 0, it's just gonna do the full resolution that again is 1280 by 128. Okay, so let's go ahead, now that we take a look at the textures, let's go ahead and build the shader. So I'll open up my content drawer again. I'll come to materials, scroll down to the bottom, and we're gonna create a new material, and I'm just gonna call it sharp text. And we'll open it up. The next thing that we need to do is bring in our textures. So I'll just drag those in. Then I'm going to plug in my base color, plug in my normal map, plug in my ambient occlusion, and plug in my roughness. Okay, so now we've got our nice little worn out wood material here, and we've got the word fishing shop there, and then we've got this fishing shop texture here. So what we need to do is scale and transform this texture so that it fits in the spot on this texture where we want it to go. Now, a while back, we created ourselves a material function that was called MF transform UVs or something like that. Let me find it really quick. I'll go to the materials. We're going to search for MF transform UVs. So I'm going to post a link to the video where I show you how to make this node right here. So if you haven't been following along and you haven't made an MF transform UVs node, go ahead and watch that video and do that. This makes it a little bit easier than if I just start from scratch on this one. So I'm going to take a shortcut and ask you to go and watch that video first so that you can create this MF transform UVs node. All right, so what we need to do is pass the right values into this node so that we get our fishing shop texture scaled correctly. So for now, what I'm going to do is we're just going to add an add node here, and I'm going to add my my albedo texture and my fishing shop texture together, just like this. And this is going to look really wrong for a second until we get our UVs transformed correctly. So I'm going to hold down the 2 key and click. This is going to give me a vector 2 value that I can use for offsetting and scaling my fishing shop texture. So first thing that I need to do, the fishing shop texture is 1280 by 128, which means it's 10 times the difference in one dimension than the other. So when I scale it, I need to add 10 times on the V coordinate than what it is on the U coordinate. So the U is going to be 1.55 times, and the V is going to be 15.55 times, or 0.5 times, and we're going to plug that into our scale. Okay, so now we've got our text scaled the right size, but you can see that because we're scaling it, it's tiling itself over and over and over. And we don't want it to do that. So I'm going to pick the texture sampler here, and we're going to come down here and it says sampler source. We're going to drop this down and pick shared clamp. And what this means is at the edges of the texture, instead of repeating the texture over and over, which is what shared wrap would do, I'm going to set it to clamp. And what that does is it doesn't repeat it. It just, whatever pixels are at the edge of the texture, it's going to repeat that instead. So clamp is going to allow us to not repeat our texture over and over. It's just going to apply it once and leave it at that. Okay, so the other thing that we need to do is kind of move this up so that we can compare our results with our added fishing shop word here with the one that's kind of baked into the texture. So I'm going to hold down 2 again and click, and this is going to be my offset. So I'm just going to offset by a value of 4. So we'll move the word fishing shop up so that it's matching with our other one. Okay, and I'll just zoom in here, and you can see there are a couple of things that we still need to do. We added that stroke around the edges of this one, which made it look all blurry. So right now, the top one is kind of sharp, but the bottom one is fuzzy because of that stroke filter that we added. So in order to fix that, what we're going to do is we're going to treat our texture as though it were a signed distance field, an SDF. And that's a really fancy way of saying, I want to take a blurry gradient and find a nice sharp edge in the middle of it. And it's actually some pretty simple math in order to do that. What we're going to do is take our results coming out of the fishing shop texture, and I'm just going to add a subtract node here. And then I'm going to hold down the 1 key and I'm going to add 2 constants. This first one is going to be our maximum value, and the second one is going to be our minimum value. And I'm going to go ahead and subtract the minimum from the maximum as well. And now this subtract up here, I'm going to plug our minimum into that. So we take the texture sample, we subtract our minimum value, and then we divide by this maximum subtracted by the minimum. And then finally, we're going to saturate the result just to ensure that we don't go outside the 0 to 1 range. And now I'm going to plug the result into our add, and we're going to add that to our texture sample. All right, both my maximum and my minimum are set to 0 right now, so we're getting this like extra chunky edge. But at least you can see how it's sharpened things up. I'm going to set my maximum to 0.9 and my minimum to 0.75. So what this is doing is the distance between the maximum and the minimum is the amount of smoothness that we're getting. So if I want a very, very sharp edge here, I could do like 0.89, and that's going to give a very sharp edge result. But the lower this value is, and the greater the distance between these two values, the smoother or the blurrier this edge is going to be. So if I give it a value of like 0.1, for example, now you can see I've got a really blurry edge. But the closer that I get, the closer that my minimum gets to my maximum value, the sharper that edge is going to be. And I happen to like a value of 0.75 there and 0.9 there. Gives just a little bit of fuzziness around the edge, but not too much that it looks out of focus. And so now you can see that I've got this really nice sharp edge on my text instead of chunky looking text like this. So just these 6 nodes here allow me to create a signed distance field effect to have a nice sharp edge on my text. So what can I do with this? Well, if I don't include the text in the background texture set, I could use, so right now I have the word fishing shop written in there, but if I were to remove that and just apply the fishing shop word using my texture over here, I could use this texture set by itself as a tiling material for something else instead of making it unique with the text baked into it. So that's one positive thing. The other positive thing is now that these things are separate, so I've got fishing shop separate from these tiling textures here. If I select my albedo texture here and limit it to a maximum texture size, I can shrink this texture down to save texture memory if I need to, and I can keep my text, because it's separate, the text stays sharp. And like I said in the intro, so this texture is currently 1280 by 128, but because I'm using this signed distance field, I can bring the texture resolution of the text texture down as well and still keep a sharp edge. So you can see it's a little bit fuzzier and maybe just a little bit wobbly, but I've reduced the resolution by more than half, and I'm still getting sharp text edges there, whereas if my text is baked into the texture itself, it just gets destroyed when we reduce the resolution. So this is a really great technique because it separates out the details here from the underlying texture, and I'm able to change the resolution of these textures independently, and I'm able to reduce the resolution on this text texture, and yet it still stays sharp. So this would be a good technique if you wanted to apply a wrap to a car with some text written on it, for example. If you wanted to apply text to a sign, anything where you need to add text in, this works really well. And not only that, but if you need to go back in and localize this text, if you need to make several versions of this in different languages, if you're shipping your game in different languages, for example, it's really easy to just localize the text portion and not have to worry about the rest of the texture set. So a lot of advantages to using signed distance fields for adding text and other sharp details to your materials. All right, well, let's jump over to Unity and I'll show you how to do the same thing there. All right, so here we are in Unity, and you can see that I've got the same kind of material set up here. I've got my old wood texture with the fishing shop lettering baked into it, and then I've also added the lettering in the shader down here below. If I take my old wood texture that I've got over here on the right and reduce the texture size down to 512, you can see that the lettering here is just destroyed, just like we saw in Unity. But our lettering that we're adding in the shader is maintained. The other thing that I want to do is select this text that we're adding here and also reduce it. So if we reduce this down to 512, you can see that the quality is reduced a tiny bit, but it's pretty insignificant compared with what we've done to this. So we're limiting this to 512, and there's just a slight change. We can maybe even go to 256. Let's see what happens if we do that. Yeah, it starts getting chunky around here, but at least the edges are still sharp, whereas this text here that I baked into the material is just really falling apart. So let's go ahead and take a look at the shader, and we'll talk about how we're using signed distance fields to achieve this. All right, so here's my shader. I've got my UV transform node that we created in a previous video, and I'll go ahead and put the link to that video down below so that you can create this node. This is the node that we're using to scale and move the text so that it fits in the correct location inside our other material. All right, so we used UV transform for that. I'm offsetting it by -4 because otherwise it's in the center, and I want to move the word fishing shop there up so that it lines up just underneath the other one. And then we're also using scale, and because the dimensions of our texture are 1280 by 128, we need to use our value here that's 10 times higher than our U value. Okay, so that's our UV transform. We plug that into our UV of our sampler texture 2D node. We're also using a sampler state node so that we can set the wrap mode to clamp. If we set this to repeat, you'll see that instead of getting clamped at the edges, the texture is just repeating itself over and over. So we want to set this to clamp so we only get one instance of our word here. All right. Then we've got our signed distance field set up where we have our minimum and our maximum. And these values here are determining where we're drawing our edge in that gradient. Values of the minimum that are lower will give a fuzzier edge or a blurrier edge, and values that are higher will give a sharper edge. So I've got this set to 0.9, this set to 0.75. And if I want it to be slightly blurrier, I can lower it. And if I want it to be slightly sharper, I can raise it. So we're subtracting our minimum from our maximum here. And by the way, these are values that you could expose if you were creating a material that you wanted other people on your team to be able to adjust and use for lots of different applications. You could expose the minimum and maximum on the SDF. And you could also expose these transform values, probably offset rotation and scale, so that they could place the text in the location on the material where they wanted it to go. So we subtract our minimum from our original texture here, and then we divide the result of that by the maximum minus the minimum. Then we saturate the result. All right, I think when I was showing the Unreal portion of this, I forgot to talk about this portion here. But what I'm doing is, after I did the SDF math there, what it gives me is a mask. And then I multiply that mask by 0.5, so it's just a little bit dimmer. And then I can use that value to blend between the color that I want the text to be and my underlying color. So I want the word fishing shop to be white in this case, and I want to blend it together with my my old worn out wood texture here. So the old worn out wood texture is the background color, or the A value of the lerp. The color of the paint that fishing shop is painted with is the foreground color here plugged into the B of the lerp. And then this signed distance field mask is plugged into the T of the lerp. And this multiply value here, I can actually use as opacity. So if I want it to look like the paint is worn off, I could set this value low. And now you can see the text is just barely visible there. But the higher this multiplier is, the more opaque that fishing shop word is going to be. And I chose to give it a value of 0.5. So it's just kind of half opaque, half transparent. Okay, so that's how we achieve the blending between the paint of the words and the background texture. And one thing that I might recommend is you could take these nodes here that we're using for the signed distance fields math, and actually make them into a subgraph. That's a really good idea. You could just make a subgraph that's called SDF and encapsulate these nodes here and expose the maximum, the minimum, and the input texture. And then instead of doing all of this every time you want to do an SDF, you could just drop in your SDF subgraph. All right, pretty cool. By the way, I've only just barely scratched the surface for what's possible to use SDFs for. You know, today we talked about sharpening the edges of text, and this is a really good application, but there are a lot of other things that you can do with it. I'll put some links down in the description to some of the sources of inspiration I had while I was researching for this video. Go ahead and check some of those out as well. You'll get some great ideas, and you might even have your mind blown by some of them. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's video. This one was really cool for me to make. I'm really excited about the potential of this technique and what you can do with it in terms of, you know, keeping details sharp and being able to lower the resolution of the textures and yet still have nice sharp details on things. Anyway, have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you in next week's video.